Hello, Mark.
Good morning.
How are you? Where are you? Maybe is the
I am
question.
in lovely Phoenix, Arizona.
Well, that is lovely. I'd like to say that
It
we
is.
have Phoenix weather, but it was 30 degrees when I drove in this morning. So, welcome. We are really glad to have you on board, and I know that we were trying to do a Skype and that didn't work. So we're just going to take your dulcet tones and your voice, and give the floor to you there in Phoenix.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for having me. I'd like to start off by saying you're all better off by the fact that you cannot see me, but trust that I did dress up for the occasion. I really appreciate being part of this, and I really am sorry that I couldn't be there. It is kind of ironic that probably one of the people who was based in the building couldn't actually attend today, but I apologize for that. So as Jim was saying, I'm the executive director of IRE and NICAR. Organizations, IRE has been around since 1975, and today we've got more than 5,000 members worldwide, journalists, journalism educators, and some journalism students. Just to give you a quick idea of what we do, we put on two big annual conferences a year, including one that we held just a week or so ago in Denver, Colorado. We do regional workshops. We do custom training in newsrooms. We do training internationally for journalists. And today, it's a good time for our organization. We're pretty much at 40-year highs for the organization in membership, conference attendance, and all those things. So you might wonder, and let's go to the next slide, please. You might wonder, what does an organization like ours, especially one made up of a bunch of investigative journalists, have anything to do with collaboration or our conference like this? And if you could go to the next slide, please. Journalists are not known for being particularly collaborative in many ways. Traditionally, especially investigative reporters, they're kind of known as lone wolves. What's interesting is that IRE's founding idea was the very idea of bringing those kinds of people together. It was the mid-1970s, and there wasn't a lot of investigative reporting going on in the country. It was just starting to take off again, as happens kind of cyclically. And what happened was a lot of investigative reporters found themselves alone in newsrooms. There was nobody else doing the kind of work they were doing where they were located. They didn't have anybody on their own staff potentially who could help them do what they do. So a small group of them got together in Indianapolis and founded this organization. Switch to the next slide, please. Right around the time of its founding, one of the more collaborative projects in really U.S. journalism history to that point took place. But one of the founding members was a guy named Don Bowles, who just coincidentally was a reporter in Phoenix, where I am today. And he was going to meet a source for a story he was working on. He was investigating organized crime and the move of organized crime into Arizona. Was called to a hotel to meet a source, went to the hotel to meet the person who didn't show up, went back out to his car in the parking lot, turned the key, and the car blew up. And Don Bowles was killed. One of the few journalists at that time, and really still, to be killed on U.S. soil for doing journalism. The other members of IRE got together and decided that they would send a group of journalists, different journalists working for different news organizations throughout the country, to descend on Arizona for 6 months to finish the reporting that Don Bowles had started. The idea of the work was that you couldn't kill the story by killing the reporter. So this sort of amazingly collaborative project took place. It took over a hotel floor, reported 6 months, and ultimately ended up with something called the Arizona Project, which continues to be a model for this sort of collaborative journalism project. It's been repeated multiple times throughout the world. And IRE itself has sort of grown into an organization that's based on that sort of collaborative nature. What's interesting is that investigative reporting in general has sort of followed that pattern as well as time has gone on, largely because of the financial cutbacks to news organizations and the growing global nature of pretty much everything we do. The need to bring in more people, to work with others has only increased. And as a result of that, investigative reporting itself has become much more collaborative than it was when I started doing this work back about 20 years ago. At our conferences now, journalists meet, they hatch projects that run weeks or months later. They do work that crosses boundaries. Our organization, sort of what we supply to our members, is completely reliant on our membership as well. We have thousands of tip sheets. Reporters come to the conference and tell all the secrets of how they did their stories, sharing them willingly with other people. It's really what we're based on. And as our conference has evolved, we've sort of changed and allowed our members to take more and more control of some of the things that we do. For example, in Denver last week, when we held our sort of NICAR data conference. The biggest event by far that we had is something called lightning talks, where people pitch individual talks. The membership votes on them in advance online, and the most popular ones are given. It's become the showcase of the conference, and it would be wonderful if I could say that we planned that, but we didn't. It started with a couple of our members just wanting to do this and doing it in a really small room, one of 9 or 10 sessions going on at the same time. The room started to get too crowded, and eventually this past week we had probably 800-900 people in the room for that one event. And that's something that just doesn't happen if it doesn't bubble up from the bottom. Next slide, please. One of the most interesting and sort of collaborative pieces of our organization is one of our listservs. Lots of organizations have listservs, and in fact, a lot of people have been moving away from those because the technology is kind of old and some people kind of boring. But what we find is that the listserv model still works really, really well for reaching people instantly and when they need to be contacted, right? Because everybody's on their email all the time. You don't have to go look in a different platform. So we've maintained the listservs, and one of them is called NICAR-L. It's a list that focuses on data journalism. And initially, that's what it was meant to do. Next slide, please. The goal of the listserv was simply to be a place for data journalists, and there were relatively few of them when we started this, to post a question if they had it, to talk about some of the data work they were doing. Next slide, please. But what it's really grown into over time is a community of its own, where journalists post not just questions, and by the way, when they do, one of the most amazing things that I've seen on a list like this, somebody posts a question, I'm working on something, I've got this data, I'm stuck, I'm not sure what to do with it. Oftentimes within 10 minutes, 3 or 4 journalists from all over the country or sometimes all over the world have posted, well, you should try this. Well, here's a piece of code you can use. Well, have you done this? And the community works together and solves that problem in amazingly short order. There's a professor actually at Kent State University who every semester pretty much for his class to prove sort of the community and collaborative nature of the NICAR community, he'll post a question in the morning, see how many answers comes in just so we can show his class how it works. And it's grown beyond that. People now post other things as well. They post general journalism questions, open records questions, occasionally life questions, things like that, job questions. So it's become a real community. Next slide, please. But what we learned sort of in the last few months was that creating a community also can come with its own unforeseen problems, I suppose. We had one of the things we do at the NICAR conference is, this is not going to sound important, and it's not, but I promise just kind of a point. We started a few years ago letting our members pitch T-shirt designs, right? And so the conference T-shirt is designed by members. They get to all pitch proposals. The proposals are voted online. Whoever's T-shirt gets voted on, we make a bunch of those shirts, and we have them at the conference, right? Fun thing, no big deal. Well, and a couple of times we've done this, and people have posted shirts that were, perhaps not appropriate for conference use. Someone will smack them down, and it moves on. This time, somebody posted a shirt, and immediately it was attacked for being sexist. Not only did this list create all this sort of controversy online, what it did was expose a lot of issues that we really hadn't realized were bubbling for quite some time below the surface. First, it turned into a conversation about the women are treated in the tech world. The NICAR conference is a data-focused conference, and really the attendance has gotten much, much, much more balanced over time. I think it's probably one of the most gender-balanced tech conferences you'll find. I was looking at it last week, and we had more than 40% of the attendees were women. However, on the listserv, a lot of concerns started to come up that women felt that they were that there had been demeaning comments that were made periodically. It then quickly grew into a conversation about whether our organization had a code of conduct. We don't. Whether we had a code of conduct that regulated conversation on our listservs and our platforms. We don't. And why we don't, and whether we should, which became its own controversy. And after about 24 hours, I went in and temporarily shut down the list just to make sure everybody's inboxes would stop being flooded. I then had a lot of conversations with members over the next couple of weeks and learned some important lessons along the way. That everything had been moving along slowly for a while, but it took one incident like this to make us realize that below the surface, there'd been a lot of concerns and a lot of sort of pent up, if not anger, at least displeasure or concern or feelings of people who were not comfortable. People started calling and talking about whether they were comfortable at the conferences or not. And as a result of all this, our board of directors got together and is working on creating, in fact, its own code of conduct. So some of the lessons that we learned from this process were, first of all, that you need to reach out periodically. That assuming everything is fine, I think we all know this probably, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is. That while it's important to create these places and platforms for collaboration to go on and for communication to occur, it's equally as important to periodically reach out to those who are involved in using those tools and relying on you to provide them and making sure that everything's actually going well. It's also fascinating in the way expectations of our members have changed over time. This whole idea of a code of conduct in 40 years of the organization had never come up. I now, through conversations with other organizations like mine, I know that many organizations either already have them or were in the process at the same time we were of looking at how to put these things in place. One more interesting thing is that we're sort of struggling with even now a little bit is that it's hard to put one kind of code and one kind of set of rules in place for different sorts of methods of getting people together to collaborate and work together. In some ways, you'd think that having people in person at our conference where they're actually physically interacting would be more difficult. But one of the things we're finding is that, in fact, it may be harder to come up with a way to regulate conduct on something like a listserv, which sort of reduces everything down to issues of speech, right? And as a journalism organization, the idea of limiting speech rubs some people the wrong way. So it's been a very instructive situation for us, and we've learned quite a bit by going through it. And while I think we'll be better off for it, I also think that that I certainly, and probably the organization, had to some extent dropped the ball by not having systems in place to make sure that things that we thought were going well perhaps had some bumps behind the surface.
Questions, comments, thoughts? Good, and there's Mark's email. We did lose just a little bit of time there, Mark, on the tie-in. But I think having a code of conduct that's such an interesting thing. Sometimes when you want to collaborate, you don't always set the rules of engagement, do you? And sometimes that can make it go awry.
Right. You'll hear that. I'm sure you'll hear from other speakers today too. But I know that some of the organizations that we work with that are doing collaborative projects across newsrooms and sometimes across countries have found the same problem, that if you don't know for sure going in who's supposed to do what, how things are supposed to work, even how communication is supposed to take place, it can create all sorts of problems.
All right. Enjoy Phoenix, will you? Do I have to ask you to do that? I don't think so.
Leaving. Right, I'm heading to the airport right after this, but I will enjoy the drive.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Take care.
Okay. All right. Bye.